On the morning of December 30th, 2002, Kenya woke up to a scene that felt impossible. The old order, so heavy it seemed welded to the country, was suddenly gone. Crowds surged, flags snapped in the wind, and a new president raised his hand to take the oath. But if you look closely at the photographs from that day, there's another figure, smiling, composed, almost quietly radiant, standing, just a step away from the center. Not the man who would hold the most power, but the man who would hold the country together when the celebration ended. And here is the sharp, unsettling contrast. The same man who helped deliver Kenya's most hopeful political sunrise was already carrying a private countdown inside his body. While the nation was cheering, time was already tightening around him. His name was Kijana Wamalwa. To understand why his presence mattered, why his voice could calm a room full of rivals, why his handshake could turn enemies into temporary allies, you have to go back to a different Kenya. A Kenya of red earth and long roads, of colonial authority and whispered resistance, of schools that promised escape and politics that promised danger. You have to go back to November 25th, 1944, to the Western Highlands, to a community where names carried history and expectations, and where a boy could learn early that leadership was not a title. It was a burden you carried in public and paid for in private. Kijana Wamalwa was born into the Luhya community, in what was then a British colony. Kenya in the 1940s was a country where power lived in offices you could not enter, where laws were written in a language most people did not speak, and where the future was something you were told to wait for. The word independence was not yet a national anthem line. It was a dangerous idea. In the villages and towns of Western Kenya, people worked, prayed, argued, laughed, and endured, while the big decisions were made elsewhere. But the 1950s arrived like a storm. The Mau Mau uprising and the colonial crackdown shook the country. Even far from the forests where the rebellion was most intense, the atmosphere changed. Fear became ordinary, silence became strategy. Children grew up hearing adults lower their voices when politics came up, as if the walls themselves could report them. And in that climate, a young Michael learned something that would define him. Words could be weapons, but they could also be shields. The right sentence, delivered at the right moment, could save a friendship, a negotiation, sometimes even a life. He was bright, quick with language, attentive to people, the kind of student who didn't just memorize facts, but watched how authority worked. Teachers noticed, elders noticed. In many Kenyan families of that era, education was not simply personal achievement. It was a collective investment. A child who excelled carried the hopes of siblings, cousins, neighbors. Michael's path through school was shaped by that pressure, but also by a genuine hunger to understand the world beyond the horizon. By the time he reached secondary education, Kenya was moving toward independence, and politics was no longer only whispered. It was debated. It was argued in marketplaces and churchyards. It was printed in newspapers. The air was thick with possibility and with rivalry. The struggle against colonial rule had created heroes, but it had also created factions. The question was no longer only how do we get freedom? It was who will control it when it arrives. In 1963, Kenya became independent. Michael was still young, but old enough to feel the electricity of that moment. Independence was not a clean ending. It was a door opening into a room full of unfinished business. The new nation had to build institutions, manage ethnic tensions, distribute resources, and define what citizenship meant. The dream was huge. The reality was complicated. For a young man with ambition and discipline, the law offered a way into the heart of that complexity. Law was where ideals met power. Law was where promises became enforceable, or where they were quietly broken. Michael chose that path, and it was not an easy one. Studying law demanded precision, patience, and a willingness to argue without losing control. It demanded the ability to see both sides of a conflict, even when one side was unpopular. Those skills would later become his political signature. Calm, measured, persuasive, never careless with words. He trained as a lawyer in an era when Kenya's legal and political systems were still settling into their post-independence shape. The country's first president, Jomo Kenyatta, was building a state that was strong, centralized, and increasingly intolerant of dissent. After Kenyatta's death in 1978, Daniel Arap Moi took power, and the political atmosphere tightened further. Kenya moved toward a de facto one-party state, and then formally became one. Opposition politics became a dangerous profession. Careers were destroyed, people were detained, newspapers were pressured, public meetings were monitored. The system did not need to arrest everyone. It only needed to make examples. In that Kenya, a lawyer could become many things: a defender of the vulnerable, a quiet negotiator, a man who understood the machinery of the state from the inside. Michael built his reputation not as a loud radical, but as a serious professional. Someone who could be trusted with complex matters. Someone who could speak to different communities without sounding like a stranger. He had a gift for bridging worlds, rural and urban, traditional and modern, elite and ordinary. That gift would later make him invaluable in coalition politics, where trust is currency and betrayal is always one meeting away. But politics has a way of finding people who understand power too well. And in Kenya, by the late 1980s and early 1990s, politics was changing. The pressure for multi-party democracy was rising, driven by activists, churches, civil society, and politicians who were tired of a system that treated competition as treason. The Cold War was ending, and international donors were increasingly linking aid to governance reforms. Inside Kenya, frustration was boiling. People wanted choices. They wanted accountability. They wanted a government that listened. The Moi era was not simply a political period. It was a psychological climate. It taught people to calculate risk before speaking. It taught politicians to read the room like a battlefield map. It taught communities to fear being left out of the national table. And it taught ambitious leaders that survival often mattered more than ideology. Michael Kijana Wamalwa stepped into this arena with a style that was both his strength and his vulnerability. He was not the kind of politician who electrified crowds with rage. He did not build his brand on insults. He did not thrive on chaos. Instead, he leaned into something rarer: restraint. He listened. He negotiated. He tried to keep doors open even when others were slamming them shut. In the early 1990s, Kenya's return to multi-party politics created a new kind of political marketplace. Crowded, volatile, and full of shifting alliances. Parties formed, split, rebranded. Leaders who had once stood together against one-party rule began competing for the same space. Ethnic arithmetic became a brutal reality. Numbers mattered, blocks mattered, and coalition building became the only path to national power. For Wamalwa, the challenge was immediate and real. How do you build a national political identity in a system that rewards narrow loyalties? How do you speak to the whole country without being accused of betraying your own? How do you oppose a powerful incumbent system without being crushed by it? He aligned himself with the opposition movement that was trying to unseat Moi's long grip on power. This was not a romantic adventure. It was a calculated risk. Opposition politicians faced harassment, intimidation, and the constant threat of political isolation. The state had resources, networks, and the ability to make life difficult in ways that never appeared in official statements. Licenses could be delayed, meetings could be disrupted, allies could be pressured, and in a country where many people depended on the state for jobs and services, fear was a political tool. Yet Wamalwa persisted. He became associated with the Forum for the Restoration of Democracy, FORD, a movement that symbolized the push for pluralism. But even within the opposition, unity was fragile. Personal ambition collided with national strategy. Leaders who agreed on the need for change disagreed on who should lead it. Splits emerged, and each split made Moi stronger. This was the central conflict of Wamalwa's early political life. Not only the struggle against an entrenched ruling system, but the struggle against the opposition's own self-destruction. It is easy to imagine politics as a simple story of good versus bad, reformers versus authoritarians. Kenya's reality was messier. The opposition could be brave and brilliant, and also divided, suspicious, and sometimes reckless. Wamalwa's temperament made him a natural mediator, but mediation is exhausting. It means absorbing other people's anger. It means being blamed by both sides. It means trying to build a bridge while everyone is stomping on the planks. He rose within this environment, gaining prominence as a leader who could speak with authority without sounding like a threat. That mattered. In a tense political climate, the wrong tone could trigger violence or invite retaliation. Wamalwa's careful approach allowed him to navigate spaces where others might have been shut out. He could sit with rivals and still be heard. He could criticize without sounding like he was calling for chaos. He could argue for reform while projecting stability. But stability can be misunderstood. In a time when many Kenyans were hungry for dramatic change, a calm voice could be mistaken for weakness. And in opposition politics, where charisma often overshadows competence, a man who refuses to perform anger can be underestimated. Still, he kept moving forward. He became a member of parliament, representing his constituency and building a base that was not only ethnic, but also personal. People who trusted him because he showed up, because he spoke like someone who had read the fine print, because he realized power. The 1992 KANU could win with a divided field. The math was brutal. If the opposition could not unite, it could not win. And every election cycle became a lesson written in disappointment. Rallies, promises, hope, and then the same result. For Wamalwa, each cycle sharpened the stakes. The country was changing. Urban populations were growing. Young people were demanding jobs and dignity. Corruption scandals eroded trust. Communities felt neglected. The pressure for a transition was building, but the path to it was blocked not only by the ruling party's machinery, but by the opposition, his inability to agree on a single vehicle for power. This is where Wamalwa's story becomes more than a biography. It becomes a study in political patience. He was not simply chasing office. He was trying to make unity possible in a political culture that rewarded division. He was trying to convince leaders who had tasted fame that compromise was not surrender. He was trying to persuade communities that coalition was not betrayal. And then came the late 1990s and the approach of a constitutional deadline that would change everything. Moi was nearing the end of his allowed time in office. The question was no longer theoretical. Kenya was heading toward a succession moment, and succession moments are when political systems reveal their true nature. They are when alliances become desperate, when promises multiply, when betrayals happen in broad daylight. Inside KANU, Moi would eventually anoint a successor, and that choice would send shockwaves through the political landscape. But before that happened, the opposition had to face its own mirror. If they entered another election divided, they would hand victory to the ruling party again, no matter how tired the country was of it. Wamalwa's role in this period was shaped by his ability to work with others, to be part of negotiations that were less glamorous than rallies but far more important. Coalition building is not a speech. It is a series of tense meetings, late-night phone calls, arguments over names, symbols, positions, and trust. It is the political equivalent of surgery without anesthesia. He became a key figure in the opposition's evolving architecture, associated with efforts to consolidate forces. His leadership in Ford, Kenya, positioned him as one of the recognizable faces of the reform movement. But recognition came with pressure. Every handshake was scrutinized. Every alliance was questioned. Every compromise risked being framed as weakness. And all the while, Kenya's political temperature kept rising. The public was restless. The economy was strained. Corruption was not an abstract concept. It was a daily tax on ordinary life. People wanted a break from the old patterns. They wanted a moment that would feel like 1963 again, like a new beginning. Yet the closer that moment came, the more dangerous it became. Because when a long-ruling system senses the end, it does not simply step aside. It fights to shape the transition. It tries to choose the battlefield. It tries to divide its opponents. It tries to make the future look like the past with a new face. Wamalwa understood this. He had watched Kenyan politics long enough to know that hope could be manipulated. He had seen how quickly unity could collapse into ego. He had seen how the state could use fear to keep people in line. And he had seen how ordinary citizens paid the price when leaders failed to cooperate. So he leaned into what he did best: building bridges. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. He was not naive about power. He knew that politics was not a seminar, it was a contest. But he also knew that Kenya's contest could not be won by one community alone, or by one party alone. It required a coalition broad enough to look like the country itself. As the 2002 election approached, the opposition's internal struggle became a race against time. Not only because Moi's era was ending, but because the window for unity was closing. Every week of delay meant more suspicion, more rumors, more opportunities for sabotage. The public could feel it. The sense that history was near, but not guaranteed. That the door to change was open, but could slam shut at any moment. Wamalwa's political identity, measured, conciliatory, strategic, suddenly became more valuable than ever. In a room full of ambitious men, the one who could keep them talking was the one who could keep the dream alive. He was not the loudest voice, but he was often the voice that prevented the conversation from collapsing into insults. And then, in the background of all this public maneuvering, there was the private reality that would later make his story feel almost cruel in its timing. The human body does not care about election calendars. It does not pause for national transitions. It does not negotiate. It simply counts down. At this stage of his life, the public saw a positive. It can be used against you. It can become a rumor, then a headline, then a weapon. So the story for now remained focused on the visible battlefield. The fight to end an era without tearing the country apart. The fight to unite an opposition that had failed before. The fight to convince Kenyans that this time would be different. By late 2002, the stakes were unmistakable. Kenya was standing at the edge of a political cliff. One step could be a peaceful democratic transition, the other could be another cycle of disappointment and division. The ruling party was preparing its succession plan. The opposition was trying to weld itself into a single force. And in the middle of that storm, Kijana Wamalwa was positioning himself not as a solitary hero, but as a crucial hinge. Someone who could help swing the door of history open. The tension was rising, and it was not only political, it was personal. Because for Wamalwa, the coming months would demand everything he had. His patience, his diplomacy, his stamina, his ability to absorb pressure without cracking. The country was racing toward an election that would redefine it. And he, whether the public knew it or not, was racing too. The election year didn't begin with fireworks. It began with suspicion. In early 2002, Kenya felt like a room where everyone had stopped breathing at the same time. Daniel Arap Moi was nearing the constitutional end of his rule, and that single fact, simple on paper, turned the entire country into a chessboard. Every handshake looked like a trap. Every press conference sounded like a coded message. Every politician who smiled too widely was accused of hiding a knife. And in the middle of that tightening air stood Kijana Wamalwa, lawyer, opposition leader, bridge builder, trying to do something that had humiliated the opposition for a decade, keep them from tearing themselves apart right at the moment victory finally looked possible. Because the truth was brutal. Moi didn't have to defeat the opposition. He only had to watch them defeat themselves. For years, Kenyans had lived through the same cycle. Hope rises, rallies swell, speeches promise a new dawn. And then the opposition. Fractures into rival camps, votes split, and KANU survives. The pattern was so familiar, it felt like fate. By 2002, people were tired of being told to wait for the next election. They wanted the next election to be the last one under the old order. But the opposition was not a single machine. It was a collection of egos, histories, ethnic calculations, and old grudges. And the closer they got to power, the more dangerous those internal tensions became. Power doesn't only attract allies, it attracts ambition. It makes friends start counting. It makes colleagues start imagining themselves at the center of the photograph. Wamalwa understood that. He had watched it happen in 1992. He had watched it happen in 1997. He had watched unity collapse into rivalry like a building imploding from the inside. And now, in 2002, he was watching the same forces gather again. Only this time, the stakes were higher than ever because Moi was leaving. The system was vulnerable. The door was open. And doors don't stay open forever. Moi's succession plan was the kind of political move that makes a country gasp. When he signaled support for Uhuru Kenyatta, young, relatively inexperienced, carrying the weight of a famous name, it sent shockwaves through KANU itself. Senior figures who had waited years for their turn, those cracks mattered. They meant something historic. The old machine could be beaten, not by slogans, not by anger, but by arithmetic, by alliances, by timing, by a coalition big enough to swallow the ruling party's advantage. And that was where Wamalwa's temperament became a weapon. He wasn't the kind of leader who dominated a room by shouting. He dominated by making people listen. He had the rare ability to disagree without humiliating, to negotiate without sounding desperate, to keep talking when others wanted to storm out. In a political culture where pride could destroy a movement, that skill was priceless. But it also made him a target, because when you are the person holding a coalition together, everyone blames you when it shakes. If two rivals can't agree, they accuse the mediator of bias. If a deal collapses, they accuse the bridge builder of weakness. And if the public wants a hero who looks like a warrior, the calm man in the corner can be mistaken for a man who doesn't matter. Wamalwa mattered. He mattered because he could move between camps without setting off alarms. He could speak to communities that didn't automatically trust each other. He could sit with leaders who had insulted one another in public and still keep the conversation alive. In 2002, Kenya's opposition politics became a race against time. And not just because of the election calendar. The longer unity took, the more time KANU had to sabotage it. Through rumors, through inducements, through pressure, through the old methods that never left fingerprints. Coalition talks were not glamorous. They were tense, exhausting, and often humiliating. They involved arguments over party symbols, over who would stand where, over who would be named what. They involved leaders who had spent years building personal brands, now being asked to step back for the sake of a shared victory. That kind of sacrifice is rare in politics. It feels like death to an ego. And yet, slowly, something began to form. The National Rainbow Coalition, NARC, was not born as a perfect love story. It was born as a necessity. It was a political marriage arranged by history. Different parties, different regions, different ambitions, forced into one vehicle because the alternative was another 5 years of the same disappointment. Wamalwa, as a key opposition figure and leader of Ford Kenya, became central to this new architecture. He wasn't simply joining a coalition, he was helping to make it believable. In Kenya, coalitions had often been temporary tricks, paper alliances that collapsed the moment someone felt cheated. For NARC to work, it needed trust. It needed a sense that this wasn't just another arrangement of convenience. It needed the public to believe that the opposition had finally learned the lesson of its own failures. And Wamalwa's presence helped sell that belief. He had a reputation for moderation, for seriousness, for not being intoxicated by theatrics. He could reassure people who feared chaos. He could speak to those who wanted change, but didn't want the country to burn for it. In a nation where political competition had sometimes spilled into violence, that reassurance was not a luxury. It was a stabilizer. But while the coalition was being welded together in public, there was another, quieter pressure tightening around him. The human body does not care about political destiny. It does not care about rallies, negotiations, or the weight of history. It does not pause because a country needs you. And Wamalwa's body was beginning to demand attention. At first, it would have been easy to explain away. Fatigue, travel, stress, the kind of exhaustion that every major politician wears like a badge. Kenya's campaign season is not gentle. It is long drives on rough roads, endless meetings, late-night strategy sessions, speeches under hot sun, crowds pressing in, hands shaking until your arm aches. It is a life designed to drain you. But there is a difference between being tired and being unwell, and the people closest to him could sense that something was not quite right. Still, in politics, illness is dangerous information. It can be weaponized. It can become a rumor that spreads faster than truth. It can make allies nervous and enemies bold. It can turn a leader into a question mark. So the public saw what politics always shows, the performance of strength. They saw Wamalwa on platforms, smiling, composed, speaking with that measured confidence. They saw him moving through crowds, receiving cheers, standing beside other leaders as the coalition presented itself as the future. They saw the image of unity, something Kenyans had begged for. What they didn't see was the private cost of holding that image together. As NARC gained momentum, KANU's campaign machinery responded with everything it had. The ruling party had resources, networks, and decades of experience in survival. It could mobilize quickly. It could intimidate quietly. It could promise development and punish dissent. It could remind communities of what they might lose if they chose the wrong side. The election became more than a contest between parties. It became a contest between two visions of Kenya. One where power remained centralized in the old networks, and one where a coalition promised reform, accountability, and a break from the past. And in that contest, Wamalwa's role was both symbolic and practical. Symbolic, because he represented a kind of leadership that wasn't built on fear. Practical, because coalition politics is fragile, and he was one of the people who could keep it from cracking under pressure. Then came the moment that turned the campaign into a wave. Moi's chosen successor, Uhuru Kenyatta, carried the ruling party's banner, but the choice had alienated powerful figures within KANU. Some of them broke away. The old wall didn't just crack, it shed pieces. And those pieces didn't fall into silence. They moved, they negotiated, they joined the opposition coalition. Suddenly, NARC wasn't just an opposition alliance. It was a national magnet. The rallies grew, the crowds became oceans. The mood shifted from cautious hope to something sharper, anticipation that felt almost dangerous, because it was so close to belief. People began to talk as if the change had already happened, as if the election was a formality. But Kenya had learned not to trust inevitability. Too many times the sure thing had collapsed. Too many times the system had found a way to survive. So the tension kept rising. Election day approached like a storm front. In towns and villages, people argued in shops and at bus stops. Radios carried speeches and rumors. Families debated at dinner tables. The country felt awake at night, and Wamalwa kept moving. He campaigned, negotiated, reassured, and stood as one of the coalition's key faces. He was not the loudest, but he was visible, steady, present, part of the image of a united front. In a coalition, visibility is a promise. It tells supporters that the alliance is real, that leaders are standing together, that betrayal is not happening in the shadows. But behind that visibility was a man who was increasingly running on something deeper than stamina, because the clock inside him was ticking, whether he admitted it or not. When December 2002 arrived, Kenya felt like it was holding its breath again. Only this time, the breath was filled with hope and fear in equal measure. The vote itself became a national ritual. People lined up, waited, argued, laughed nervously, watched the process with the intensity of people who knew they were touching history with their fingertips. And then, as results came in, the impossible began to look real. KANU was losing. Not in whispers, not in contested margins. In a way that could be felt in the streets, in the sudden change of tone on the radio, in the way people began to speak more openly, as if a weight had shifted off their tongues. When the victory became clear, Kenya erupted. It wasn't just celebration. It was release. It was years of frustration pouring out as song, dance, tears, and disbelief. People climbed on vehicles, waved flags, hugged strangers. The country looked like it had been waiting decades for permission to exhale. And then came December 30th, 2002, the inauguration. The images from that day are bright with symbolism. A new president sworn in, the end of an era, the promise of reform. But in those images, Wamalwa stands close, smiling, composed, dignified. He is sworn in as Vice President of Kenya, a position that, in that moment, carried enormous meaning. Because the vice presidency was not just a title, it was a signal. It signaled that the coalition's unity would be reflected in government. It signaled that different regions and communities would have a stake in the new order. It signaled that the victory was not owned by one man alone, but by a broader alliance that had finally done what many thought impossible. For Wamalwa personally, it was the culmination of years of opposition struggle. Years of watching unity fail. Years of trying to keep conversations alive. Years of being underestimated because he refused to perform rage. Now he stood at the center of a national turning point. But here is the cruel twist. The moment he reached the summit, the ground beneath him was already unstable. The new government inherited a country with enormous expectations. Kenyans wanted corruption tackled immediately. They wanted jobs. They wanted services. They wanted justice. They wanted the old habits of power to disappear overnight. But governments do not change like a light switch. Institutions resist. Networks fight back. People who benefited from the old system don't simply vanish. They adapt. They hide. They sabotage. They wait for the new leaders to make mistakes. And the new leaders did make mistakes, because they were human, because coalitions are messy, because power reveals fractures that victory can temporarily hide. In those early days, Wamalwa's role as vice president was not merely ceremonial. He was expected to help hold the coalition together inside government, to be a stabilizing presence, to represent the administration, in key moments, to reassure the public that the promise of unity had not been a campaign costume. But the demands of office collided with the demands of his health. The pace did not slow after the election. If anything, it accelerated. The transition into power is a different kind of exhaustion. Briefings, security protocols, state functions, diplomatic meetings, internal disputes, the constant pressure of being watched. Every word is analyzed. Every absence is noticed. Every rumor becomes a headline. And then the absences began. At first, they could be explained away. A trip, a rest, a medical check. But the pattern grew harder to ignore. The vice president, so visible during the campaign, so present at the inauguration, was now appearing less consistently. In Kenya's political atmosphere, absence is never neutral. It invites speculation. It invites fear. It invites opportunists. People began to ask questions in the way people do when they sense something serious but aren't being told the full truth. Is he okay? Is it stress? Is it something worse? Is the government hiding something? What does it mean for the coalition if he is not strong? And inside the government, the stakes were even sharper. The vice president was not just a person. He was a pillar of the coalition's balance. If that pillar weakened, the structure could shift. Wamalwa, for his part, was caught in a trap that many leaders face. To admit vulnerability is to risk political instability, but to hide vulnerability is to risk a sudden crisis. He traveled abroad for treatment. The details were not always clear to the public, and that uncertainty fed the rumor mill. In a country newly intoxicated by change, the idea that one of the key faces of that change might be seriously ill felt like an omen. And yet, even as his health became a quiet national concern, the government's work continued, and the political battles inside the new administration began to surface. Coalitions are easiest to hold together when they are fighting a common enemy. Once they win, the enemy disappears, and the coalition members start looking at each other. Who gets which ministry? Who controls which resources? Who speaks for the government? Who will be the face of reform? Who will be blamed when reforms hurt? Who will be credited when they succeed? These questions are not abstract. They are the daily fuel of political conflict. Wamalwa's style, calm, conciliatory, was again needed. But now, the very thing that made him valuable was being threatened by his physical limits. The country needed him present, visible, active, but his body was forcing him into a different rhythm. And time was becoming the real antagonist. Not Moi, not Kanu, not even the internal rivalries of the coalition. Time. Because while Kenya was celebrating a new era, while ministers were settling into offices, while the public was demanding immediate transformation, Wamalwa was facing a private reality that did not care about national optimism. His health was deteriorating, and the window for him to fully inhabit the role he had fought so long to reach was narrowing. The contrast was almost unbearable. A man who had helped deliver Kenya's most hopeful transition, now struggling to remain physically present in the government that transition created. In public, the administration projected confidence. It had to. A new government cannot begin by looking fragile. It cannot admit uncertainty without risking panic. So the official tone remained steady, even as the vice president's condition became harder to conceal. And in the background, Kenya's political instincts, honed by decades of power games, began to activate. People started calculating what his absence might mean, not just emotionally, but politically. Who would gain influence? Who would lose it? What would happen to the coalition's internal balance? This is the dark side of politics. Even when a leader is suffering, the system keeps moving and people keep counting. Wamalwa returned at times, appearing in public, offering reassurance through his presence. Each appearance became a kind of proof of life for a nation that had grown attached to the idea of him as a state. It wanted justice delivered, flesh and blood. Wamalwa. It was discussed in whispers, in newspapers, in political circles. The vice president's illness was no longer just a personal matter. It was a national anxiety. And for Wamalwa himself, the pressure must have been suffocating. To be a symbol of unity while feeling your own strength slipping. To be expected to stabilize a government while your body demands rest. To have finally reached the place you worked toward for years, only to realize you may not have time to live in it. That is the kind of tragedy that doesn't announce itself with drama. It creeps in quietly, stealing days. The country had entered a new era, but one of the men who helped open the door was now fighting a battle that no coalition could negotiate away. And the deadline was not written in the Constitution. It was written in his body. The cruelest thing about power is that it doesn't wait for you to be ready. One day you're standing on the bright grass of Uhuru Park, the air vibrating with a nation's relief, the cameras catching your smile, as if it's proof that history can be gentle. And the next day, you're inside State House corridors, where the light feels colder, where every door hides a file, a rival, a demand, a disappointment. Kenya had voted for a new dawn, but dawn is not a sunrise. It's a fight with the night that refuses to let go. Michael Kijana Wamalwa walked into the vice presidency carrying two clocks. One was public, the clock of a country that had waited nearly 40 years for a peaceful transfer of power away from the old ruling machine. Kenyans wanted results at the speed of their own hunger. They wanted corruption to vanish like smoke. They wanted jobs, roads, medicine, school fees that didn't break families. They wanted the police to stop being feared. They wanted the courts to stop being jokes. They wanted the word reform to stop being a campaign song and become a daily reality. The other clock was private, and it was louder than any crowd. It was the clock inside his body, ticking without mercy, indifferent to speeches, indifferent to titles, indifferent to the fact that he had finally reached the summit he'd been climbing toward for decades. And between those two clocks, Wamalwa had to do the job. The vice president of Kenya is often described as a spare wheel, a position that can be ceremonial, a shadow behind the president. But in the first months of the NARC government, nothing was ceremonial. The coalition that had defeated Kanu was not a single organism. It was a stitched-together creature made of old rivals, new allies, and ambitions that had been temporarily disciplined by one shared goal: win. Now they had won, and victory is where coalitions go to die. Inside government, the unity that looked so solid on campaign stages began to show hairline fractures, not always in public, not always in speeches, but in meetings, in appointments, in who got access to the president, in who controlled which ministry, in who could place allies into key offices. The old enemy had been Moi's system. Now the enemy was something more intimate, the temptation to turn a national victory into personal territory. Wamalwa's role, by temperament and by political necessity, was to be the glue. He had always been the man who could sit between egos without flinching, the man who could speak without inflaming, the man who could disagree without turning it into a blood feud. In a government born from compromise, that skill was not soft, it was structural. So his days filled with the unglamorous work that keeps a state from wobbling: consultations, mediation, representation, diplomacy, and the constant exhausting task of making sure the coalition didn't start eating itself. He chaired meetings, he received delegations, he listened to grievances that sounded like policy but were really about power. He attended state functions where every handshake was photographed and every absence was interpreted like a prophecy. He stood in for the president when needed, because the new administration had to look present everywhere at once: at home, in the region, in the eyes of donors, in the eyes of investors, in the eyes of ordinary Kenyans who had placed their hope, like a fragile glass, on the table and were watching to see if the leaders would knock it over. And then there was the other work. The work that doesn't appear in official schedules but defines a transition: dismantling habits. The NARC government had promised to end the culture of impunity. That phrase, impunity, had become a Kenyan curse word, a shorthand for everything that had gone wrong: corruption without consequences, violence without accountability, theft without shame. But impunity is not a single person you can arrest. It's a network, it's a reflex, it's a way of doing business that survives by changing its clothes. Wamalwa understood that. He had been in opposition long enough to know that the system doesn't collapse just because the election results say it should. It resists, it adapts, it tries to embarrass you, it tries to tempt you, it tries to make you compromise just this once, and then again, until you wake up and realize you've become what you fought. So the early months were a sprint through a minefield. The government moved to signal seriousness. Anti-corruption rhetoric sharpened, investigations were talked about more openly, and the public mood was electric. Half celebration, half impatience. Newspapers began to act like watchdogs again, testing the new leaders with questions that would have been dangerous under the old order. Civil society pushed hard, because they knew this moment might be the only window before the system re-hardened. But the more the government promised, the more it was trapped by its own promises. Because Kenyans didn't just want a new administration, they wanted a moral cleansing. They wanted the past punished. They wanted stolen wealth returned. They wanted the powerful to feel fear for the first time. And that kind of demand creates a dangerous pressure. It can push leaders into dramatic gestures, into public purges, into symbolic battles that look good on television but don't change the machinery underneath. It can also create disappointment so sharp it turns into cynicism, especially if the new leaders begin to look like they're protecting their own. Wamalwa, again, was positioned as a stabilizer, not because he was weak, but because he was careful. He knew that reform without strategy becomes theater, and theater can be fatal when the audience is angry. Yet even as he tried to help steer the government through this storm of expectations, his health began to intrude more aggressively, like an alarm that refuses to be silenced. At first, the public saw only fragments: a missed event, a delayed appearance, a trip abroad. In Kenya, leaders are expected to be physically present, constantly visible. Visibility is treated like proof of competence. So when the vice president was not seen, the absence became a story in itself. And stories in Kenyan politics are never innocent. Rumors began to breed in the gaps. Some were sympathetic, concerned whispers that he was overworked, that the stress of transition was crushing him. Others were crueler, the kind of rumors that appear when politics smells opportunity, that he was being sidelined, that he was out of favor, that the coalition's internal battles had pushed him into the shadows. In a country trained by decades of intrigue, people didn't just ask, "Is he ill?" They asked, "Who benefits if he is ill?" Because the vice presidency was not only a job, it was a balance point. Wamalwa's presence in the top leadership was part of what made NARC feel national rather than sectional. It was part of what reassured communities that the new government wasn't simply replacing one monopoly with another. It was part of what made the coalition's victory feel like a shared achievement rather than a takeover. So when his health faltered, it wasn't only a personal tragedy, it was a political tremor, and inside government, tremors are felt immediately. The administration was already dealing with the reality that reform is expensive, not only in money, but in enemies. People who had thrived under the old system did not disappear. They watched, they waited, they whispered into ears, they offered help. They reminded new officials how things were done. They tried to make the new government stumble early to prove that change was a fantasy. At the same time, the coalition's internal factions began to test each other. The unity of the campaign was being replaced by the mathematics of succession, influence, and control. Who would be the face of the government? Who would shape policy? Who would control appointments? Who would speak for the president when the president was not in the room? In that environment, Wamalwa's illness was not just a health issue. It was a vacuum forming, and vacuums in politics are violent. They pull people in. Still, Wamalwa tried to work. When he appeared with dignity. Measured, composed, refusing to let the public see panic. He had always been a man of restraint, and now restraint became armor. He could not afford to look fragile, because fragility at the top of a new government can trigger instability below. But the body has its own politics. It negotiates nothing. The trips abroad for treatment became more frequent. The public was told enough to calm them, but not enough to satisfy them, and that partial information, half reassurance, half silence, only fed the national imagination. Newspapers speculated, radio talk shows turned his health into a daily topic. In markets and matatus, people argued about what was really happening. And then, as if the country needed a reminder that history is never clean, Kenya was hit by a shock that had nothing to do with elections, and everything to do with vulnerability. The Kikambala hotel bombing in late 2002, and the attempted missile attack on an airliner near Mombasa. The attacks were a brutal visual: smoke, shattered glass, blood, sirens, an image that cut through the euphoria of political change, and reminded everyone that a new government inherits not only hopes, but threats. Security became urgent, diplomacy became urgent. The government had to prove it could protect the country, not just reform it. And in those moments, the leadership needed to look united, steady, in control. Wamalwa's role as a senior statesman mattered. He was part of the face Kenya showed to the world. A country turning a page, a country capable of peaceful transition, a country that could be trusted. International partners watched closely. Donors watched. Investors watched. The region watched. The world loves a success story, but it loves even more the moment a success story collapses. Because collapse confirms cynicism, so the pressure on the new administration was relentless. Deliver reforms, maintain security, keep the coalition intact, and do it, all while the public's patience burned down like a candle in a wind. And Wamalwa, the man who had helped build the coalition, was now fighting to remain present inside it. There is a particular cruelty in being needed most when you are least able to give. It's like being asked to hold up a roof while your arms are shaking. In government, decisions were being made quickly. Appointments were contested. Anti-corruption promises were being tested by reality. The public began to notice that some old faces were still around, that some old habits were hard to kill. The phrase, "nothing has changed," began to appear again, cautiously at first, then louder. And every time disappointment rose, the government needed its most trusted figures to reassure the nation, to speak, to explain, to calm, to promise that the work was happening, even if it wasn't visible yet. Wamalwa had that credibility. He had spent years in opposition without being swallowed by bitterness. He had a reputation for decency, for moderation, for not being intoxicated by the ugliest parts of politics. People who didn't agree with him often still respected him. In a polarized environment, that kind of respect is rare currency. But credibility is useless if you are not there to spend it. As 2003 moved forward, the tension around his health became a constant hum. The government tried to manage the narrative, because governments always try to manage narratives. But illness is a narrative that refuses management. It leaks through the cracks. It shows up in the eyes, in the weight loss, in the slower steps, in the longer pauses. And then came the moment when the private clock began to drown out the public one. Wamalwa traveled to London for treatment. To many Kenyans, London is not just a city, it's a symbol of serious illness. The place leaders go when local hospitals are not enough. The place that signals that something is beyond routine. The very fact of being treated abroad carried its own emotional weight. It made the situation feel bigger, more final, more frightening. Back home, the government continued, because governments always continue. Meetings were held. Policies were announced. Parliament debated. The president travelled. Ministers fought their internal battles. The machinery of state does not stop because one man is suffering. But the country watched the empty space where Wamalwa should have been. And in that empty space, politics began to sharpen its knives. Because if the vice president could not return fully, what would that mean? Would the coalition's balance shift? Would certain factions gain dominance? Would the government's internal tensions explode? Would the promise of national unity begin to look like a brief illusion? These questions were not asked politely. They were asked with the hunger of people who know that power is never sentimental. Yet even in London, Wamalwa remained, in a strange way, at the center of Kenyan politics. His illness became a mirror, reflecting the fragility of the new era. Kenya had defeated a political system that seemed immortal, and now one of the men who helped do it was facing a different kind of immortality. The kind that comes when people begin to speak of you in the past tense, before you are gone. Reports filtered back. Some sounded hopeful, others sounded guarded. The uncertainty was torture, because uncertainty invites imagination, and imagination tends to choose the darkest picture. And then, in August 2003, the news landed with the blunt force of a door slammed in a silent room. Michael Kijana Wamalwa was dead. He died in London on August 23, 2003, still vice president, less than a year after taking office. The timing was so cruel it felt unreal. The man who had waited through decades of opposition struggle, who had finally stood at the center of Kenya's most hopeful transition, had been given only a handful of months to live inside that victory. Kenya reacted the way a country reacts when it loses a symbol, with shock that quickly turns into grief, and grief that quickly turns into fear. Because death at the top is never only death. It is a question mark. The government had to respond immediately, not only emotionally, but constitutionally, politically, strategically. The vice presidency was vacant. The coalition's internal balance was threatened. The public needed reassurance that the new era would not unravel. The world was watching again, waiting to see if Kenya's story would remain a success story or become another African tragedy of transition. And in the middle of that national grief, there was something else, something quieter but sharper, a sense of theft. Not theft of money, not theft of land, but theft of time. The feeling that Wamalwa had been robbed of the chance to become what he might have become in government. That Kenya had been robbed of the steady hand it had just begun to rely on. That the coalition had been robbed of one of its key stabilizers at the exact moment it needed stability most. His body had imposed the ultimate term limit. The funeral became a national event, heavy with symbolism. Leaders spoke in solemn tones. Crowds gathered. The rituals of state tried to contain the rawness of public emotion. But beneath the official mourning, the political calculations continued, because they always do. Who would replace him? What would that replacement signal? Would it strengthen the coalition or fracture it? Would it calm the country or inflame it? The appointment that followed, Mwai Kibaki naming Moody Awori as the new vice president, was not just a personnel decision, it was a message. Awori, like Wamalwa, came from Western Kenya, a choice that aimed to preserve regional balance and prevent the sense of betrayal that could have ignited resentment. It was a move designed to keep the coalition's architecture from collapsing. But no appointment could replace what Wamalwa had been. Not just a seat filled, but a particular kind of presence. Because Wamalwa's power had never been only in his title. It had been in his temperament, in his ability to cool a room without humiliating anyone, in his ability to speak without turning every sentence into a threat, in his ability to make politics feel, at least for a moment, like something other than war. After his death, the NARC government continued, but the atmosphere subtly changed. The coalition's internal tensions did not disappear. If anything, they became harder to manage without one of the key mediators. The public's expectations did not soften. If anything, disappointment became more volatile. The new era was still new, but it was already learning the old lesson. That change is not a single victory, and that the people who deliver it are not guaranteed the time to protect it. And that is the haunting image that remains from Wamalwa's final months in office. A man standing at the edge of a historic sunrise, holding together a fragile coalition with one hand while his own body slipped away from him with the other. Kenya had beaten a political giant, but Wamalwa was fighting a smaller, quieter enemy, one that doesn't negotiate, doesn't fear elections, doesn't care about crowds. Time won. The first thing Kenya learned after Michael Kijana Wamalwa died was this: grief has a sound. It isn't only the wailing at the airport, or the hymns that rise and break in church halls, or the low murmur of people packed shoulder to shoulder along a road waiting for a hearse to pass. It's the sound of a country suddenly realizing that the future it was celebrating has already been altered. Quietly, brutally, by one fact no manifesto can argue with. The vice president is gone. And the second thing Kenya learned was even colder. Grief has a timetable. Because the moment the news came from London on August 23, 2003, the nation didn't just mourn. It calculated instinctively, anxiously, sometimes shamefully. Not because Kenyans were heartless, but because Kenyan politics had trained everyone to understand that death was not only a personal tragedy, it was a structural shock to a government that was still balancing itself on promises, alliances, and fragile trust. He had entered office with two clocks ticking, one public, one private, and now the private clock had stopped. But the public clock kept pounding forward, louder than ever, demanding answers. Who would replace him? What would it mean for the coalition? Would the new dawn survive its first real storm? In those first hours, the country's emotions moved like weather. Disbelief, then anger, then sorrow, then fear. People who had never met him spoke as if they had lost a relative. People who had criticized him in Parliament now spoke of his decency. People who had dismissed him as too soft suddenly understood what softness had been doing, holding the sharp edges of power apart, so they didn't cut the nation. And then the body came home. There is a particular kind of pain in watching a flag-draped coffin descend from an aircraft. It turns politics into something physical. It forces the mind to accept what it keeps trying to deny. The cameras captured the solemn faces, the military precision, the official choreography of state mourning. But beyond the protocol, beyond the uniforms and the salutes, there was a rawness that no ceremony could fully contain. Because Wamalwa's story had been built on patience. He had waited through the long Moi era, through the years when opposition politics meant harassment, surveillance, and the constant risk of being crushed by the machinery of the state. He had waited through the slow, grinding work of coalition building, through the betrayals and reconciliations, through the endless meetings where egos had to be managed like explosives. He had waited until Kenya finally did the unthinkable, voted out the old ruling party. And then, when the victory came, time gave him only months. That was the theft people felt. Not the theft of money, but the theft of a chance. A chance for him to shape the new government. A chance for the country to see what kind of vice president he might have become if his body had not turned against him. The funeral rites unfolded with the weight of history. Leaders arrived, speeches were written, condolences were delivered. The nation watched itself mourning on television, as if trying to confirm that the grief was real. In Western Kenya, where his roots ran deep, the mourning was not abstract. It was intimate. It was the feeling of a son of the soil being taken away too soon, of a community's pride being wrapped in black cloth. And yet, even as the hymns rose, the political clock kept ticking. The Constitution did not pause for tears. The government could not drift. The coalition could not afford a leadership crisis. The world was watching Kenya's transition like a test case. Could an African opposition victory produce stability, or would it collapse into factional chaos? President Mwai Kibaki had to act, and when he did, when he appointed Moody Awori as the new vice president, it was not merely a replacement. It was a message aimed at preventing a rupture. Awori, like Wamalwa, came from Western Kenya. The choice was meant to preserve a sense of regional balance, to reassure those who might have felt suddenly unrepresented, to keep the coalition's architecture from cracking under the strain of suspicion. But even the most strategic appointment cannot replace a personality. Wamalwa had been more than a seat. He had been a particular kind of political instrument. A mediator who could enter a room full of rivals and leave it with fewer enemies. A man whose calmness was not weakness, but method. A leader who understood that in a country with deep ethnic and political scars, the tone of leadership can be as important as the content of policy. After his death, something subtle shifted in the air of Kenyan politics. The coalition that had been held together by shared victory began to feel the pull of competing futures. The internal tensions that Wamalwa had helped soften did not disappear, they hardened. The government still spoke the language of reform, but the public began to notice how quickly old habits could return, wearing new suits. The anti-corruption promises that had sounded like thunder on the campaign trail began to meet the slow, stubborn reality of institutions that resist change. And in that environment, Wamalwa's absence became more than emotional. It became practical. Who would calm the quarrels before they became wars? Who would speak across factions without sounding like a threat? Who would remind the coalition that it had been built to defeat a system, not to inherit its worst instincts? Kenya did not collapse. The state continued. Parliament sat. Budgets were debated. Roads were built. Scandals erupted. Life moved on, because life always moves on. But the sense of a stabilizing hand missing from the wheel lingered, like a vibration you feel in a car after a tire has been damaged. Still moving, still functioning, but never quite as smooth. And then came the next twist in the story of his legacy. The way death can turn a politician into a symbol that different people try to claim. To some, Wamalwa became the face of what could have been, a leader who might have helped steer the NARC government away from the internal fractures that later widened. To others, he became a reminder of the fragility of reform itself, that even the best intentions can be interrupted by forces beyond politics. To many ordinary Kenyans, he became something rarer than ideology, a memory of decency in a field that often rewards cruelty. But symbols are dangerous because they can be simplified. And Wamalwa's life was not simple. He had been a man of privilege and education, yes. Alliance High School, the University of Nairobi, the University of Warwick. He had been a lawyer, a polished speaker, a figure comfortable in formal rooms. But he had also been a man who chose opposition when it was costly, who stood in Parliament when it was safer to be silent, who helped build alliances when it was easier to build personal empires. His political identity was shaped by a real conflict that never stopped chasing him. The struggle to oppose an entrenched system without becoming consumed by the bitterness that system produces. That is a quieter conflict than street battles or dramatic arrests. But it is just as real. It is the conflict of restraint, the conflict of staying human in a profession that rewards dehumanization, the conflict of refusing to turn every disagreement into a permanent enemy. And it is also the conflict that made his death feel like a national loss rather than a partisan one. Politicians spoke about unity, they invoked him. When they spoke about moderation, they invoked him. When they spoke about the early hope of 2002, they invoked him. Sometimes it was sincere, sometimes it was opportunistic, but either way it revealed something important. Wamalwa had left behind a kind of moral footprint. Not perfection, not sainthood, a footprint, evidence that a different style of leadership had existed at the center of power, even if only briefly. His family carried the private weight behind the public mourning. The cameras eventually left. The speeches ended. The flags were folded. But the absence remained in the places cameras don't film. In quiet rooms, in anniversaries, in the sudden moments when someone reaches for a phone to call a person who is no longer there. And Kenya, too, carried its own version of that private absence. Because Wamalwa's death did something else, something almost cruel in its timing. It forced the country to confront the difference between winning an election and building a new political culture. The election of 2002 had felt like a clean break, like a door slammed on the past. But his death, so soon after that victory, was a reminder that history doesn't change in one night. It changes through people, through relationships, through habits, through the slow work of keeping coalitions intact and institutions honest. And when one of the people most suited to that slow work disappears, the work becomes harder. In the years that followed, Kenya's politics continued to evolve, sometimes forward, sometimes backward, often sideways. The hopes of the early NARC era met the realities of governance, competing ambitions, corruption allegations, policy battles, and the constant pressure of public expectation. The country would face new crises and new turning points, moments that would test the very idea of national unity. And in those moments, the memory of Wamalwa often returned, not as nostalgia, but as a question. What if he had lived? What if he had been there, in the rooms where decisions were made, when tempers rose and alliances strained? What if the man who could cool a room had been present when the room began to burn? No one can answer that. History doesn't allow reruns. But what can be said, clearly, concretely, is what he did leave behind. He left behind the record of a man who rose through law and politics without becoming a caricature of power. He left behind the example of coalition building as a craft, not a slogan. He left behind a reputation for civility that survived the brutalizing pressure of Kenyan political life. He left behind the image of a vice president who, even while fighting a private battle with his own body, tried to serve a public that demanded everything at once. And perhaps most hauntingly, he left behind a lesson about time. Because Wamalwa's life is a story of delayed arrival, he spent decades moving toward a moment that finally came, only for that moment to be cut short. It is the kind of story that forces a nation to ask itself uncomfortable questions about what it expects from its leaders, and what it does with the leaders it has. Do we only value them when they are gone? Do we mistake loudness for strength? Do we confuse aggression with effectiveness? Wamalwa was not the loudest man in the room. He was not the most theatrical. He did not dominate with fear. And yet, when he disappeared, the space he left behind was unmistakable. That is the paradox of his legacy. His power was most visible after it was removed. Today, his name still carries weight in Kenya's political memory. Not because he ruled for long, he didn't. Not because he had time to implement grand personal programs, he didn't. But because he represented something that is always in short supply in transitional democracies. Trust. Trust that a leader can disagree without destroying. Trust that a leader can hold power without humiliating others. Trust that a leader can be ambitious without being predatory. Trust that politics can be more than a permanent emergency. And that is why his story still matters. Because Kenya's transition in 2002 was not only about removing a party from power, it was about proving that the country could change without breaking. Wamalwa was one of the faces of that proof. Calm, composed, bridging divides, helping a fragile coalition look like a national government. Then time intervened, and the final sharp image remains. A man who finally reached the summit, looked out over the promised land of a new Kenya, and was given only a brief moment to stand there before the ground disappeared beneath him. Not defeated by an opponent, not toppled by scandal, not removed by voters, but outpaced by the one rival no politician can negotiate with, no coalition can outvote, no speech can persuade. Time. And the question his life leaves hanging, quietly, relentlessly, is not only what he could have done with more time, it's what Kenya will do with the time it still has.
Turekererie president wito athie bururi atutongorie na ithuĩ turangire mucii.